Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters. Welcome to this week's live chat. I just have to say, if you're watching live, thank you so much. I know I really enjoy getting on about 30 minutes before, chatting with everybody, seeing how everybody's doing, answering any questions. Sometimes those come up. It's a really great time. If you're watching this live, don't forget you can type your questions in the chat. Jessica's here to monitor those, and she'll give them to me at the end so I can answer your questions live. And if you're not watching it live, no worries. The jokes are just as funny, whether you're watching it live or later. You can leave your questions in the comment section. So I'm excited today. I've got a little bit of stuff to talk about with the upcoming challenge, and then kind of answer your questions about that. I'm super excited though because all of the product is in. We are cutting and we look like it's going to ship out pretty soon. So if you ordered it, no worries, it's going to be going out real soon. I'm super excited. It's always a crazy time around here, and I took a little video to show you here in a second. Next week's live chat is on Thursday, which here in the States is Thanksgiving, so I will not be on here Thursday, but I thought, well, instead of canceling, what if we move it to Friday and I do like a Black Friday live chat edition where I'll show you some of the Black Friday sales we're going to be having here. So if you want to join me for that, next Friday at 3 p.m. and then we'll start back on Thursdays and get going with that. So very excited. All right, let me go to my photos. Like I kind of alluded to, we're going to be starting that free motion challenge, that free video series where we quilt together through a project that's coming up December 6th. I announced it a couple weeks ago, and it's a really fun way to practice machine quilting with other people because I think our brains will do difficult stuff if we can do it with other people. And so it's going to be a great time. Just a reminder, here's a schedule. How it happens or how this works is you watch the video when it comes out, and then I'll go live on Thursdays to answer your questions about that week's topic, about what we went over. And so it's always on my YouTube channel. It's always free to participate. And the last week's live chat, I went over exactly what you needed to get started, which was not a whole lot. You don't need everything to get started. But if you want to quilt along with me on the custom panel, which I'll be demonstrating on, you can still get those, and you can still take advantage of that deal. Buy the big one, get the smaller one, a half off. That's going to be ending soon. So if you've been on the fence, you can click the link in the description box and it will take you to it, and you can take advantage of that promo code. We still have panels left. That's not going away, but the promo code will be ending soon. So if you were on the fence thinking about it, that'll be the way to do it. So first of all, I took this little video. Jessica's going to kill me. Jessica's in the red shirt. I took this little video of us cutting and packaging fabric. It's quite the thing. You should see like the assembly line. It's right across the hall from this live chat studio. And so we'll be doing more of that here in a little bit, just cutting fabric and folding. So if you've ever wondered, wow, what goes on? Well, we don't cut that fast, but we sure try. All right, in this live chat, it's a little bit, not abstract, but I want to just talk real quickly today about how to approach the quilt, this particular quilt, if you're working on a sit-down machine where you move the fabric or a stand-up machine where you move the machine. One thing that's always been kind of the hard thing for me to kind of do with the video challenges or the video series is it's different how you approach a quilt depending on the type of machine that you're using. That's not to say that you can't quilt along with me because I've shown you on both, but just kind of a heads up before we get started, here's kind of what we're going to be dealing with. So as you can tell, the panel that we're going to be quilting on is a mandala, right? Kind of in the circular form. It's not your traditional quilt looking thing with our blocks on a grid. When we're looking at quilts like that have that more traditional layout, having the blocks on the grid kind of gives us a really good plan to follow. But when we throw in something like this, where it's circular, it's kind of, starts in the center and builds out, it can be hard to know how to approach that type of quilt and how to start it. I was trying to think of the best way to title this, like how to tackle your quilt, but I thought, oh, that doesn't sound right. But how do you approach it? So first of all, if you're working on a sewing machine, this is the bigger version. Again, we have two size versions. The center is the same. But if you're quilting on a sit-down machine where you move the fabric and not the machine, whether that's a sit-down long arm, whether that's your sewing machine, an industrial quilting machine, whatever that is. The good news is, if you're working on that type of machine, you can start anywhere you want on the quilt. You're going to go ahead and make your quilt sandwich like you normally would in your preferred method, whether that's pins, whether it's spray-based, whether it's fusible batting, and then you can start anywhere you want on the quilt. Now, in this challenge, we're going to start in the center, and we're going to work on each ring, working our way to the outside. So that's going to be, I won't say pretty easy, but it's going to be a great way to approach that on your sit-down machine. The one thing I want to the one caveat I want to throw out there is when we're working in the round like this, it can be really tempting, especially on a sit-down machine, to want to twist it And we're going to try to avoid that. We're going to try to turn it carefully, because if we do a lot of twisting of the quilt, that's where we start to see tucks on the back, which is not the end of the world. I don't have a problem if there's a tuck on the back of my quilt. I call it ruching and move on. However, if we're wanting to avoid that, we're going to kind of see in the challenge, how can we approach those different areas? That means if you do have some quilting experience, you feel somewhat comfortable with this, you're going to be quilting those designs in all different directions, as opposed to rotating the quilt. Now, you definitely can rotate the quilt. We'll talk about that too through the video series, but just know that we're going to start in the center, and then we're going to build off it and move around and kind of tackle it that way. Now, one question I want to answer, which this comes up from time to time in our live chat, when you're quilting on a sewing machine, where should you start? Do you have to start in the center? You don't have to start in any one particular place. You can start anywhere you want. If you think about it, your quilt sandwich is already stabilized and you're good to kind of hop around and pick and choose where you want to start and where you want to quilt. However, I usually like to start in the center because it's never heavier than it is at that point. You got all that bulk everywhere. You're doing this motion push and you're rolling in it, trying to get it where it needs to go. So I do prefer starting in the center. And even though we are starting in the center on this particular quilt, you don't have to do it that way. That's just how we're doing it because it makes sense with the layout of the quilt. So again, you can see as we get to the outside, though, we're going to start seeing sections that we got to rotate and work our way around. So really, quilting on a sit-down setup where you're moving the fabric is not too different than any other quilt. It's going to feel very, very similar. Where we kind of get into, I don't want to say trouble, but where we have to start doing some things a little different is if we're quilting on a long arm or a frame setup where we're moving the machine and not the quilt. Okay, so already, if you have a long arm or that setup, you're probably looking at this like, great. Because we know that starting in the center is not super easy. You can't just advance the quilt, start there in the center and go, because the rest of it that's rolled up has to be stabilized and taken care of. So if you're approaching this type of quilt on that kind of setup, we're going to handle it just a little bit different. Now, I'm going to pause before I show you. I've got some videos of me preparing the quilt, how I got it ready for this. But there is, when you're working on a long arm, there is that conundrum, right? And I get it. If you have a long arm, you put a quilt on the frame. If this challenge takes 6 weeks, plus we're taking a week off for Christmas, that's 7 weeks to have that quilt on your frame. That's not ideal. I would not want that. So you need to either be comfortable taking it off and putting it back on, or you can wait till the end, you can watch the videos, and then you can do it all at once. So even though this particular quilt, I'm taking care of it, I'm stabilizing it, get to the center, if I were to actually do this on a regular quilt, like if I was just quilting this panel for myself, I would start from the top and work down. So again, I know it's a little bit different, but how you approach it is just kind of wrapping your brain around it. So here we can see I have the panel on my long arm. I'm fortunate enough to have a long arm right here in the filming studio, so I loaded it, and what I did is starting from the top down, I'm just quilting around the outside of all those elements. So I'm kind of stabilizing the quilt, which is kind of weird to think about it, because normally I like to quilt every section while I'm there and move on. Very like top down, how I like to approach that. But I know that if I want to start in the center, all that has to be stabilized, that's rolled up on that take-up lever. And I know that if I want to take it off and come over and quilt a little bit on my sewing machine for filming, put it back on, it's going to make it a lot easier if that whole thing is stabilized. So this is a smaller panel on the machine, and I've actually have it loaded sideways. Very handy trick. If you have a long arm, you probably already know that. Loading a quilt sideways might be easier because you just don't have to advance as many times, depending on the style of the quilt and the backing you're using. But this one I loaded sideways, and I just started working my way down, quilting around the outside of those elements. Now, I used white thread to do this for a couple reasons. White thread I knew would kind of blend in with the background, and if it showed up on some of the colored parts, I could always color in that part of the thread with a fabric marker. Not that I'm probably going to take the time to do that, but it just, it was an easier option. So here we can see, I just took a quick little video. I worked my way down, stitched around all those elements. I'm not putting anything in it yet. This is purely to stabilize it so that I can move my way back and forth. Now, when I'm doing this actually on a quilt, when I'm actually quilting a quilt, it's not ideal for me to do it this way because I normally use that traveling or that stitching in the ditch to get from one part to the next. So this is going to make it different for me, how I go from one part of the mandala to another, but it's very important though to have that stabilized. Again, if you want to start in the center of a quilt on your long arm, anything that you roll up on your take-up lever needs to be stabilized in one way or the other. And so here I'm just doing it all, just kind of getting it over with, that way I can be done. Now there are some bigger sections though where I didn't have any details to go around, so that's where I'm adding some extra pins in just to kind of stabilize that area, and that way I don't have to worry about it, shifting on me. And I just put those pins in. Those are just the same corsage pins that I load the quilt with, and I just put them in parallel to the bar so I can roll it up and roll it back. And so basically, as I'm working my way down, I'm taking those 3 layers and they're gonna be all one when I get to the end. In fact, at this point, I could be like, you know what, I'm done, but we know I'm gonna add some more quilting. Now you can see I'm at the bottom of my quilt, so now that I have the whole thing stabilized, I can now move back and forth wherever I want on that quilt. Now I can kind of start in the center, I can jump around. I don't have to worry so much about anything that, shifting, because it's all been stabilized. So this is the ideal right here. Now I can go to the center, add my details, and move on throughout the quilt. So it does take a little bit more time on up front, but it definitely makes it easier if I'm going to be trying to start in the center and trying to work my way around that. And so you can see here I've kind of worked on started quilting the center, and I'm just going to kind of work my way out, advancing that quilt back and forth. The cool thing about long arms is they really do make the quilting process faster, but it also changes how you have to approach the quilt. Instead of being able to pick up anywhere I want to go, I can't. I have to be very particular about the way I work through it. And then also another thing that we're going to have to think about for those of you that are moving the machine is I can't change the orientation of the quilt very easily. I can't just say, you know what, I don't want to use the ruler in this direction, so I'm going to turn the quilt. Now technically I could take it off and turn it and then reload it, but that's not going to be ideal to do over the long term. So when you're working through that, it definitely changes the way you approach it. And so I think the thing is just knowing how to make what you have work for you is going to be ideal. So for instance, we're going to be doing some ribbon candy in this challenge because it's a great design to wrap around elements. On a sewing machine, if you quilt ribbon candy best left to right, you're going to be able to rotate your quilt and do that. On a long arm, we're going to have to learn how to do it in all different directions. So that's not bad, it's just different ways to approach it, different ways to handle it. So if you're quilting along with me during the challenge, which is starting so very soon, you're going to get your quilt ready, you're going to get it basted and stabilized if you're doing it on a sewing machine. And if you're doing it on a long arm, if you want, you can go ahead and load it and do that stabilizing process if you'd like. What makes it nice is once it's all stabilized all the way down, it's easy to take off and pin back on, and then you can switch back and forth between it. Again, I'm not telling you how to participate if you're using a long arm, just letting you know that there's different ways to go about it. I was at a class one time not too long ago, and they're like, how should we do this on a long arm? I'm like, oh, I would totally wait to the end and do it all at once because I wouldn't want my frame to be taken up that long. But again, it's totally up to you. So I know that was kind of quick and kind of abstract, but I want to give you the encouragement to know that when we work through this, you can approach those quilts in totally different ways. Do we have any questions about that? Thank you, thank you. I am so excited about getting this challenge started, about quilting along, because we're going to be talking about things that aren't, I'm going to say, I keep saying abstract, but they're kind of like more technique based, not design based. So how do you choose how you're going to echo? Like the first week, we're going to talk about echoing. Like, do you do all of the echoing and then add another one, or do you do it as you go? It's going to be kind of fun. Okay, do I have any tips on washing/drying homemade quilts? Okay, this is a personal preference. I just wash them in the washer. I just lay them out and let them air dry. The quilts that I make and we use around the house, they're meant to be loved, and so they don't get much special treatment. However, if that makes you nervous, you can hand wash them. You could, I don't know, do that. If anybody has any different suggestions, this would be great for other viewers to leave comments, because I know that there's a lot of strong opinions on this. So I don't have a super strong opinion on it. All right, do I ever machine quilt on cuddle fabrics? Yes, so cuddle is like minky. It's that fuzzy polyester, not fuzzy, fleecy, soft, super soft quilt or fabric, and it's great for the backs of quilts because it just makes a quilt that is so cuddly and so heavy and just warm. You can do that on a sewing machine, no difference. You're still gonna make your quilt sandwich the way you normally would. On a long arm, the main difference is that that fabric has a little bit of stretch to it. So if I am using something like that on the backing, I'm going to make sure that I'm not tightening it too tight. I have done this before, and it is just so sad. If you tighten that fabric up too tight and you quilt, when you take it off, it relaxes, and then your quilt is like round. So just be sure that you don't do it too tight. And the cool thing is if you're doing cuddle or that minky fabric, you can't really see the bobbin thread. So when I see those kind of quilts, I like to use up partial bobbins. All right, so did I basically outline all of the colored shapes when I was working my way through on the long arm? Yes. And I just outlined pretty much the outside because they're not big shapes. And so I knew I was going to come back later and fill them in. So yeah, just stitching right along that seam, right along that outside to stabilize it. Now I should say, you don't have to do it this way. If you're on a long arm, you could use basting stitches if you want, just baste the whole thing, and then you can advance back and forth. If I wanted to, I could have just used a lot of corsage pins to hold it down and go back and forth. So as long as it's stabilized, that's the most important thing. And if you want, I went all the way to the bottom and just stabilized it so I can just go back and forth. If you're starting at the center and you're kind of working up, you can just stabilize till you get to the center, and then kind of you have a little bit of room to work back and forth there. Just know there's options on how you handle that. And one of these days I will figure out how to host a video series that works great for both types of machines and how we approach it. At this point, I try to alternate between like starting in the center and starting at the top. So again, I'm so excited. I hope that if you are quilting along with us, that you'll post any questions that you have. Looking forward to sharing, going on that journey with you. If you're not, you can still watch the videos, because even if you're not working on the panel, there's still going to be takeaways that you can apply to other quilts. So it's not like you're not going to be able to use the info that we're going to be learning. All right. Well, I thank you so much for hanging out with me. I hope that everybody has a great week. Looks like it's cold out there in most of the U.S., so hopefully you're staying warm. And then don't forget, you can join me next Friday, just a day after our normal chat time, for another live chat, but we'll do like a Black Friday edition or something where we'll do some giveaways and some sales. And then that will pretty much land us pretty close to the challenge starting. So very, very excited. Well, I hope everybody does well, and I will see you next week and on next Friday. And until then, everybody, happy quilting.